June 22, 1941.
Imagine being captured in the chaos of war. You've been torn from your homeland, forced into enemy hands, and you expect the worst: hunger, brutality, maybe even death. Now, imagine instead being led into a camp where a tray of warm food is placed in your hands: bread, meat, potatoes, coffee, more food than you've seen in months. For many Soviet prisoners of war held by the Americans during World War II, this moment felt surreal. Why? Because back home, on the front lines, and especially in German captivity, starvation was the norm. And suddenly, in an American-run camp, the very people you were taught to fear and hate were feeding you better than your own army ever had. This is a story of how Soviet POWs were astonished by the food in American prison camps, and what it reveals about two very different worlds colliding in the middle of the 20th century. By the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union was thrown into the largest invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa. Within weeks, entire Soviet divisions were surrounded. Columns of exhausted Red Army soldiers, many barely armed, were marched into captivity. For those captured by the Germans, the nightmare began immediately. The Geneva Convention rules, which generally applied to British and American prisoners, were deliberately ignored for Soviets. They were seen as subhuman in Nazi ideology, undeserving of humane treatment. Starvation was weaponized. A day's ration might be a crust of dark bread bulked out with sawdust, or a watery broth that barely contained any real vegetables. Prisoners grew skeletal within weeks. In some camps, men died at such a pace that mass graves had to be dug daily. Those who survived did so by eating grass, weeds, even leather torn from boots. In the most desperate cases, cannibalism took place, an unspeakable choice forced by hunger. For a Soviet soldier, capture almost always meant a slow, degrading death. This expectation of horror shaped the way any Soviet POW would later view captivity. So when a small number ended up in American hands, the contrast could not have been more shocking. The vast majority of captured Soviets never made it westward. They perished in German camps, on the Eastern Front, far from Allied lines. But there were exceptions. Some Soviet men were conscripted into German auxiliary units, the so-called Hiwis, or helpers. Others were forced to wear German uniforms and fight, often under threat of death. As the Allies advanced across Europe in 1943 and 1944, they captured these mixed German units and discovered Soviet soldiers among them. There were also Soviet prisoners liberated directly from German camps by US or British troops. Emaciated, sick, and expecting brutality, these men were stunned when they were not only spared but taken to camps where they were given food and medical care. For them, the first moments in Allied custody were filled with tension. They braced for beatings, for starvation, for another chapter of cruelty. Instead, they were handed blankets, shown barracks, and led to dining halls. It was a surreal reversal of everything they had come to expect from captivity. The initial shock always began with food. Accounts describe Soviet prisoners standing in line with tin trays, watching as American cooks ladled out steaming portions of stew, potatoes, beans, and slices of bread. To men who had fought over rotten potato peels in German camps, this was unthinkable. Breakfasts included oatmeal or cornflakes, bread with butter, sometimes eggs, sometimes jam. Lunches offered hearty stews or meat dishes. Dinner might bring beans, pasta, or even fruit. And above all, coffee. For many Soviet POWs, coffee was exotic, something they had never tasted before. The bitter, rich drink was bewildering, but became a symbol of abundance. The portions themselves were staggering. U.S. military regulations specified calorie counts for prisoners that often exceeded what civilians back home in the USSR or even ordinary American families under rationing received. Some Soviet prisoners couldn't finish their first meal. They were so used to starvation that their stomachs rebelled against real portions. Others suspected a trick, believing the Americans were fattening them up for an unknown, sinister purpose. But days passed and the food kept coming. Slowly, disbelief turned into relief. The abundance in U.S. camps cut deep because of the contrast with home. In the Soviet Union, wartime famine was constant. Civilians in Leningrad starved through the blockade, surviving on as little as 125 grams of bread per day. Rural peasants saw their crops requisitioned by the state, leaving their families hungry. Even Soviet soldiers on the front often received meager rations: watery cabbage soup, stale bread, a little buckwheat. Officers fared somewhat better, but hunger was still the common condition. So when a captured Soviet soldier sat down in an American camp and ate a full meal of meat, potatoes, and bread, it felt almost insulting, like the enemy could feed him better than his own country. Some remembered it as their first true encounter with the prosperity of the West. The memory was unforgettable, not just because it saved their lives, but because it raised the haunting question: why did the so-called decadent enemy provide more dignity in captivity than the Soviet Union did to its own fighting men? Food wasn't the only shock. Life in American camps, while far from comfortable, carried a level of order and predictability that felt foreign to Soviet POWs. The camps were ringed with barbed wire and guard towers. Daily roll calls, curfews, and strict rules reminded everyone they were prisoners. But the environment was nothing like the brutality of German stalags. Prisoners received clean uniforms, medical attention, and beds with blankets. Many were put to work on farms, in workshops, or maintaining the camps themselves. This labor was not forced in the way German work details had been. In many cases, it even allowed prisoners to earn privileges or small comforts. The calories given to Soviet POWs in American custody often exceeded 3,000 per day, higher than the wartime rations for U.S. civilians back home. For men who had nearly starved, this was astonishing, almost unbelievable. Leisure activities existed too: libraries, sports, even religious services. In this setting, the prisoners could regain some sense of dignity and humanity. Compared to the nightmare they had escaped, the American camp seemed almost unreal. Yet, this strange mercy carried a dark shadow. Back in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin had declared, "There are no prisoners of war, only traitors." To him, surrender was betrayal, no matter the circumstances. When the war ended, Allied forces prepared to return Soviet citizens to their homeland. Many Soviet POWs begged to stay in the West, fearing what awaited them. They were right to be afraid. Repatriated Soviet prisoners were often interrogated by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Some were accused of collaboration, others were sent to special filtration camps, and many disappeared into the Gulag system. The very memories of being treated humanely in American camps became dangerous knowledge. It was proof that the capitalist enemy could offer more to a Soviet soldier than his own state. And so silence became survival. Few spoke of it openly after returning. The astonishment of Soviet POWs wasn't just about being fed. It was about glimpsing an alternate reality. They had been raised on propaganda that the West was cruel, decadent, heartless. Yet in captivity, they saw order, abundance, and humanity. It did not mean that they turned pro-American or forgot the destruction wrought by Allied bombers, but it planted questions. Why did the enemy treat them with dignity while their own homeland branded them as traitors? For some, the experience quietly reshaped how they thought about their government. For others, it remained the haunting memory they dared not speak of for decades. The story of astonishment over food, then, becomes a symbol of something larger. The clash between two worlds, two ideologies, and two definitions of human dignity in the midst of the bloodiest war in history.
Stories like this remind us how history is never black and white. It's full of contradictions, human struggles, and moments of unexpected humanity. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden sides of World War II. And let me know in the comments, did this story change the way you think about the war? I'd love to hear your thoughts.